Sonny stared at the dark abyss of the canyon, his mind empty. A second passed in stunned silence. Then another. Finally, he turned around and looked back, as though capable of gazing through the armored hull of the Rhino. He breathed a quiet curse, which he was, in a way, there, behind the heavy AFC. The other vehicles of the convoy had hit the brakes, barely avoiding slamming into each other. They were crowded on the mountain road, snow dancing in the narrow beams of the headlights, and behind the convoy, the flood of darkness was rushing forward, stretching its tentacles in their direction. They had maybe a minute before the mass of dark beetles reached the rear vehicle. This time, Sonny wasn't going to be able to protect it. He might manage to destroy hundreds, or even thousands of the ghastly insects, but it would be like a drop in the ocean. None of his attacks would be able to deal the titanic wave of darkness any serious harm, especially because, as Sonny suspected, the beetles weren't technically alive. Not only did he not hear the spell announcing the kills while slaying the few that had crawled into his armor, but the mere fact that the damned creatures traveled with him through the shadows meant that they were somehow akin to inanimate objects. Sonny was only able to carry those with him through Shadow Step. After all, what good would it do to kill a bunch of bugs that weren't even alive, to begin with?
Captain, what do we do?
Sonny glanced at Luster, then said in a hoarse voice,
"What else run we have to run?"
Then he silently disappeared into the shadows. A moment later, Sonny was standing at the edge of the broken road, looking into the bottomless abyss below. The biting cold of the polar night caressed his skin, and the strong winds instantly tried to push him down. Behind him, the tide of black beetles was devouring the cracked surface of the road, getting closer and closer, and the mountain continued to quake, erupting with a flood of darkness. The canyon was somewhere between 100 and 200 meters wide, with steep vertical slopes that stretched far, far down. There was no secondary road to skirt its edge or descend to its bottom, only the broken bridge and the vast schism separating the fleet from the opposite side. Sonny gritted his teeth. There wasn't much time to think, so he did the first thing that came to his mind, without even stopping to consider if it was possible to pull off. If it was impossible, he would just have to change that. His essence surged, coursing through his veins with tremendous speed, and then flowed outward. His face paled as his eyes turned into two pools devoid of any light. Just as the darkness disgorged by the mountain moved, the shadows covering its slopes moved, too. The deep murk drowning the deep canyon boiled, rushing upward. Two black pillars suddenly broke through the snow covering the sides of the shattered road and rose into the sky, growing taller and taller with each second. At the same time, the tide of shadows rushing from below reached the edge of the broken bridge and bent, freezing for a moment above the bottomless canyon like a wave that was about to break. But instead of breaking, the shadows continued to spread forward and solidify, as if forming a dark path above the abyss. If there was no bridge for them to cross, Sonny would just have to build one of his own. He was expending so much essence that his soul felt as if it had come under strain. However, instead of slowing down, Sonny doubled his efforts. On the far side of the canyon, two more pillars rose, and another surge of shadows stretched into the air, growing meter after meter to meet the first one. Long tentacles of darkness shot from the tops of the pillars, turning into unbreakable chains. From them, dozens of smaller chains fell, fusing into the black surface of the growing bridge. Sonny wasn't concerned with how much essence he had. However, he was worried about the structural integrity of the hurried construct and the speed with which he would be able to connect the two parts of it. There wasn't much time left. But there were very few people in the world who knew more about forming connections out of chains. After all, he had spent so much time in the ruined Kingdom of Hope, traveling from one island to another across the heavenly chains that bound them together, chained together, inseparable, and stronger for it. There was probably some philosophical lesson to learn from it all, but Sonny was too preoccupied to care. With a groan, he stepped aside and waved to Luster, who was staring at him through the windshield of the Rhino.
"Drive."
The young man looked at him with wide eyes, then glanced at the eerie black road that hung above the abyss, connected to nothing and only supported by dozens of swinging chains. Then, with trembling hands, he sent the APC rolling forward. Its massive wheels soon abandoned the cracked asphalt of the broken road and touched the black surface of the shadow bridge. The manifested path of shadows shook slightly, but held. It bore the full weight of the Rhino. And then that of the next vehicles that drove onto it, and then the next. Soon, the whole fleet left the solid ground and entered the aerial road built by Sunny. He grabbed the metal handle on the hatch of the last vehicle and allowed its momentum to pull him with it, then climbed onto its roof and crashed down on the cold alloy. After several seconds, Sunny glanced back at the approaching wave of darkness. It was already so close, too close, somewhere ahead. The Rhino almost reached the end of the growing road of shadows. The APC was moving faster than Sunny was capable of making the bridge manifest itself. But luckily, the second part of the path was already close. The two sides of the black bridge connected and fused with each other just a few seconds before the massive Rhino rolled over the invisible seam and continued to speed forward without pause. Soon after that, Luster let out a shaky breath as the wheels of the Rhino touched solid ground on the other side of the canyon. Sunny was feeling like he was on the verge of fainting, but forced himself to remain absolutely focused. Behind him, the myriads of dark beetles were already crawling across the shadow bridge. The wave of them was almost halfway across, putting so much pressure on the chains that a few of them were ready to snap. It was at that moment that the vehicle he was riding on shuddered as it passed between two tall black columns. Sunny muttered a bitter curse about the bastards. Looking back, Sunny grinned. "This is a toll bridge. Pay up or die." On second thought, just die. With a quiet groan, he released the mass of shadows that had followed his will, allowing them to return to their natural immaterial form. A sense of profound reprieve almost sent him stumbling off the roof of the moving vehicle. The shadow bridge suddenly turned ghostly, collapsing into shapelessness, and then dissipated into the night. Myriads of dark beetles plummeted down, and even more of them continued to flow from the slopes of the battered mountain, plunging into the abyss of the canyon like waterfalls of pure darkness. But the fleet was safe. It continued moving forward, putting more and more distance between itself and whatever it was that had dwelled in the network of old tunnels. Sunny let out a heavy sigh, and then sprawled listlessly on the roof of the military vehicle, looking at the distant tapestry of cold stars. No more tunnels, damned ever, I hope. Chapter 944, Safe and Relatively Sound. After the ominous mountain disappeared from view, hidden by the snowy slopes and darkness, the mundane darkness of the polar night, not the unfathomable true darkness that they had just barely escaped from, the convoy finally came to a stop. Around them was the familiar landscape of the Antarctic center, deep in the mountains. They were temporarily protected from the wind by an overhanging cliff, and had reached a wide area that was somewhat fit to serve as a campsite. The vehicles needed to be checked after the recent mad dash, and the people needed time to come to their senses. Plus, they had no idea where they were. Sunny had to scout the area, determine their location on the map, and come up with a route forward. He also needed to make sure that there were no swarms of nightmare creatures close by or heading in their direction, and do 1,000 other things.
I don't want to.
Creating a bridge of shadows had cost him a lot of essence, but the mental strain had been far worse. Sunny felt tired and lazy, but he had no choice except for to get busy right away. Rolling off the roof of the military vehicle, he landed on the snow, sighed, and sent his shadows to explore. By then, the members of his cohort and other people had already emerged from their transports. Some went about establishing a camp and searching for good watch posts, while some headed toward him with complicated faces. Pretty soon, he was surrounded by the irregulars. A few of them looked relieved to find him safe and relatively sound. Others were mostly full of questions. Luster, who had witnessed more than the rest, was the first one to speak.
"Captain, sir, that was something else."
Sunny simply nodded, in agreement with the young man. For a change, Luster hesitated for a few moments, then asked cautiously what it was. Exactly. He stared at Sunny and added in a suddenly hoarse voice,
"I don't mean that amazing bridge you made. I mean the other thing, the one that almost gobbled us up."
Sunny didn't answer for a while. Eventually, he shook his head and looked south with a dark expression. He admitted that he didn't know. he had a few ideas, though the being that had dwelled in the old tunnels was too vast and powerful to be a simple nightmare creature. It reminded him a lot of the crimson terror of the Forgotten Shore. So, perhaps, it was also a terror, one that had gone into a slumber to evolve into a titan. Or maybe a titan that was in the process of evolving to a higher rank. Or maybe it was a creature that had entered the process of evolution, only to be devoured from the inside by a different, more insidious abomination. In any case, Sunny was certain that he and Saint had messed the whole process up, somehow, and even lived to tell the tale. Speaking of Saint, he wondered if she was all right. The damned beetles hadn't seriously wounded him. But she had been standing much closer to the eerie black dimension, whether it was a heart, a harrowing egg, or a chrysalis. When it burst open, Sunny hadn't seen his shadow since. He was also curious why her broken stone sword had managed to harm the sphere when the cruel sight failed. Sunny knew that Saint wasn't destroyed, since he had felt her return back into his lightless soul after being dismissed. But she might have sustained severe damage. Sunny gave several orders to the irregulars, checked on Professor Obel, and then found a quiet place to find out. Somewhat nervous, he summoned Saint, but nothing happened. Damnation! Just as thou, H. Something wasn't right. The quiet demon's absence felt different from how it usually was when wounded shadows slept in the nurturing black flames, repairing themselves. He almost couldn't feel her at all. Concerned, Sunny dove into the soul sea, stared at the 4 dark suns of his shadow cores for a few moments, and then summoned the runes: Shadows, Marble Saint, Soul Serpent, Nightmare. The runes describing the serpent were lifeless, indicating that it was outside his control. Saint's, however, appeared normal. He concentrated on her name and read,
Shadow Marble Saint, Shadow Rank Ascended, Shadow Class Demon.
Everything looked normal, however, at the very end of the field of shimmering runes. A new string of them appeared. Sunny's heart skipped a beat.
And Marble Saint is evolving.
What? He remained motionless for a while, then sighed. So that's how it's. Leaving the soul sea, Sunny looked up, breathed in the cold air of the polar night, and smiled crookedly. He was both happy and despondent. Saint had risen to a higher class once before, after slaying the Forsaken Knight. Back then, she had ripped a strange dark jewel from his chest and ate it. Then, his shadow, who had been an awakened monster at the time, disappeared back into his soul to enter the process of evolution. Saint must have gotten something from the dark sphere as well. Sunny was elated to know that she was evolving once again, wondering what form his Shadow Knight would assume and what powers she would gain. However, he also remembered that, last time, her evolution to a higher class had lasted for more than a month, robbing him of her support throughout the civil war in the Bright Castle. This time, too, he would be left without his strongest aid for a while. Saint must have known that, too. So this time, she didn't return into his soul core of her own free will, instead choosing to remain in the waking world to assist him. However, Sunny had dismissed her himself, not knowing what that would entail. He sighed.
Well, there was no other choice, anyway. That was the only way to get her safely back to the convoy.
And now, the safety of the fleet was laying squarely on his shoulders, and his alone. When she returned, her powers would undoubtedly be much greater. Sunny was going to need every bit of that power to survive the rest of the Antarctica campaign. But for now, he murmured for Saint to rest well, that she had deserved it. For now, he would have to lead the fleet the rest of the way to Erebus Field without his faithful shadow.
I better get busy then. It wouldn't do to have Saint return only to see that we are still stuck somewhere in the mountains. No, not at all. We're both going to be ascended devils, so I'll have to work hard to, not be overshadowed by my own shadow.
He looked down and let out a bitter sigh.
Again.
Somehow, almost everyone in the convoy was still alive. Looking at it from the roof of the Rhino, Sunny felt both burdened and surprised. He hadn't really expected to get this far into the mountains without suffering severe casualties. Was he supposed to feel proud of himself? Let's try to keep it this way, then. By now, his shadows had already climbed the nearest peaks, allowing him to observe the surrounding area. The tunnel they had escaped from might not have been endless, but as it turned out, it was actually quite long. More than that, it cut straight through the mountains instead of meandering its way around the gorges and canyons. As a result, and due to the previous days of travel, the convoy had managed to cover a lot of ground and was more than a third of the way to Erebus Field. Sadly, the good news ended there. Sonny glanced at the screen of his communicator, then climbed back into the interior of the APC and opened the map of the Antarctic Center as a projection in the command suite. He muttered that it was troubling. They had reached the edges of the section that he had marked back in the abandoned bunker. From here onward, all Sonny had to go on was the stock map, which wasn't very detailed and outdated on top of that. The battle between the Saints and the Titans had changed the topography of the entire region, and there were the effects of the chain of nightmares itself to consider, too, of course. He could always repeat the process and update the map with the help of his shadows again, which was exactly what he had been planning to do, and why his mood was currently so foul. With a sigh, Sonny started to put new marks on the projection. Soon, the position of the convoy was surrounded by a sea of red lines and symbols that stretched far to the north, with barely any green in between.
Well, damnation.
The path ahead was going to be rough, to say the least. They must have been relatively close to the place where the three saints of the First Evacuation Army had battled the Winter Beast, the Goliath, and the Whispering Legion, eliminating the latter Titan. The resulting earthquake had destroyed a good chunk of the mountain range and made a mess of the surrounding area. Sonny was trying to come up with a way to get the convoy through that mess, but it seemed all but impossible. Most of the roads were destroyed, and those that remained were buried under heavy debris. Avalanches, landslides, and rockfalls were everywhere, reshaping the landscape. The damage was much worse here than Sonny had expected, and there were nightmare creatures, of course. The whole area was seething with them, and he had already spotted at least 24 active gates, with more probably hidden from view by the overturned terrain. Sonny wasn't sure if the Rhino would be able to make it through, let alone the civilian vehicles. No matter how hard he tried to find a safe route, there seemed to be none to be found. His mood turned dark. After a while, Sonny decided to get a fresh pair of eyes to take a look at the map, or better yet, several. He ordered the irregulars to gather in the APC and invited Sergeant Gier as well. Professor Obel was already there, so Sonny simply asked the old man to join him in the command suite. Soon, everyone arrived, and an improvised strategy meeting started. The result was about as disturbing as Sonny had expected. No one seemed to have a good idea on how to proceed. Dorn was currently pointing at a certain point of the map.
If we can use our echoes to lead the nightmare creatures deeper into the gorge, we might be able to drive past this gate without being swarmed by enemies. From there, we can follow the auxiliary road to the pass and get some breathing room.
Samara shook her head.
Even if we manage to avoid the nightmare creatures, you are overestimating the civilian transports. Most of them won't make it on this extremely rough terrain. We are already struggling to keep them from falling apart, and this whole stretch of the mountains is basically a high-intensity obstacle course.
She sighed, then looked at Sonny with a somber expression.
There's one more thing everyone is forgetting about, too. Fuel cells. They aren't exhausted yet, but going through a gauntlet like that will put them under strain, which I don't think we can afford. Driving through the mountains is one thing, driving through this disaster zone is another.
Sonny frowned, then glanced at Sergeant Gier.
Can't we improvise something to charge the transports up?
The soldier hesitated for a few moments. Eventually, he sighed.
We can cannibalize the military vehicles, if need be. The power systems aren't exactly compatible, but with the help of awakened Kim and Samara, some sort of converter can be rigged. The soldiers can join the refugees inside the transports. But apart from the obvious loss of defensive capability, there are other factors against that solution. We aren't too high on energy reserves ourselves, and the transports are much more power-hungry. So it won't be a drastic change, maybe a difference of another 100 kilometers or so in this cold.
Sonny let out a heavy sigh, thinking of other solutions. There were all kinds of wild ideas in his head, like hitching one of the transports to Nightmare and letting the black steed pull it like a mundane drudge. The Rhino could manage one, too. Hell, with a proper harness. Sonny would probably be able to pull one of the transports himself. That would be a sight to behold. He grimaced.
Join the army, she said. You'll earn lots of contribution points, she said. Curse it all.
Was that why he had become an officer? To be strapped into a damned yoke and pull a wagon like a glorified ox? The idea was ridiculous. Anyway, sure, it was theoretically possible to pull the civilian transports in case they lost power. But what about heating? What about light? How would the civilians survive hundreds of kilometers of traveling through the mountains in the middle of a polar night without those things? At that moment, Luster suddenly spoke.
There's an option that we are all overlooking, isn't there? One that's not only viable as far as terrain is concerned, but will also get us to Erebus Field within a day.
The others looked at him with confusion while Sonny's face darkened. The young man smiled sheepishly, then added,
I mean, I know that it's risky, but it's right under our noses.
With that, he pointed at the map. There, at the very edge of the mountains, a thick red line was stretching far north, the coastal highway. The coastal highway, that damned thing. Sonny was, of course, aware that traveling by means of the highway was an option, an incredible option, even considering that the highway was wide, flat, kept in good condition, and stretched most of the way to the very northern edge of the Antarctic center as it skirted the whole landmass between the mountains and the ocean. But that was exactly the problem with it, built along the coast. It was both awfully close to the water and utterly exposed. Here in the mountains, they were hidden from most of the prowling nightmare creatures by the terrain, and could use it to their advantage. Out there on the coast, nothing would be protecting them from the hordes of abominations, both those on land and those hiding beneath the waves. Sergeant Gier and the other survivors of the initial, much larger convoy could attest to the horrors of the coastal highway. They had barely escaped it once, losing most of the transports and every member of their awakened escort in the process. Indeed, the soldier looked incredibly tense at Luster's suggestion.
With all due respect, you don't know what you're talking about. That place, it's a death trap. A handful of us managed to survive a shorter journey across the highway than what you are proposing, and even that was by some miracle.
Luster scratched the back of his head.
Yeah, but your situation back then was different.
Gier frowned and asked how so. The young man looked at him with surprise.
I mean, isn't it obvious? You didn't have the captain with you.
What? Sonny stared at Luster for a few moments, dumbfounded. Did the fool finally lose his mind? However, Sergeant Gier's reaction to the ridiculous response was out of his expectation. Instead of mocking Luster, the soldier looked down and cleared his throat in embarrassment. Well, that's true indeed.
Thanks for the vote of confidence, but I am not a miracle worker. I am afraid of the coastal highway, too.
There was a reason for why he had chosen a much longer, much more arduous journey through the mountains. After all, even if the highway offered a convenient path to their destination, it held a much higher risk of running into something that none of them was prepared to handle. From hordes of nightmare creatures akin to the devouring cloud to the damned terror that had slaughtered every living soul at Low 49, to countless other horrors no one knew about. Even running into a titan wasn't out of the question. The winter beast was being contained somewhere in the north by St. Tyrus, but the location of the monstrosity that Army Command had designated as Goliath was currently unknown. Nothing was stopping the bastard from showing up the moment the convoy got stuck in the open. However, traveling through the mountains had turned out much more dangerous than Sonny had anticipated. Despite his habit of always expecting the worst, by now, he had successfully managed to lead the convoy into pretty much every possible terrible situation that they had been supposed to avoid by not choosing the highway. With the path ahead so close to being impassable, and the civilian transports falling apart on the steep, unreliable mountain roads, the more dangerous route was starting to look more and more attractive. Kim sighed.
Sorry, I hate to agree with Luster, but there are about 600 kilometers between us and Erebus Field. That's if we go straight, of course. If we have to maneuver through the mountains and circle around them in search of passable roads, fighting nightmare creatures as we go, I doubt that many of us will make it.
She sighed, then threw a tentative glance at Sonny.
If we descend to the coastal highway, however, and go at full speed, we can cover these 600 kilometers in a matter of hours. Of course, this is a huge risk. But isn't it an even bigger risk to stubbornly push forward through the mountains, if it means staying in the wild for days, maybe even weeks more?
Sunny winced. Kim was somewhat right. The coastal highway was dangerous, but so were the mountains. They were teeming with nightmare creatures of all sorts and were too hard to navigate in the wake of the earthquake. There was also the matter of time, which no one except for Sunny and perhaps Professor Obel seemed to be aware of, since they weren't looking at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture, from what he could tell, wasn't looking too swell. The First Army wasn't earning any victories against the tide of abominations. Instead, its position was gradually worsening. Those additional days and weeks Kim had mentioned were much more important than she knew. For more than one reason, Sunny sighed. In the end, both choices were terrible. Remaining in the mountains was a bit safer, but also a bit hopeless. Trying to charge the coastal highway was much more dangerous, but also offered a much more realistic chance of salvation. It was like rolling a die. Do I feel lucky today? He remained silent for a long time, then deactivated the projection and looked at the people gathered in the command suite. Everyone tensed, waiting to hear his decision. Sunny tiredly rubbed his face.
Prepare the vehicles to go all out. I want them to be able to keep their top speed for at least 6 hours without ever slowing down. Do everything you can. I don't care if the transports completely fall apart and explode after that. Just make sure that nothing breaks down on the road. Either way, it'll probably be their last ride, so prepare well. We will be taking the scenic route along the coast.
With that, everyone was suddenly extremely busy. Getting the convoy ready for a high-speed charge across the coastal highway wasn't a small task, especially considering that it was most likely going to turn into a rolling battle. Sunny was one of the few soldiers that had nothing much to do, so he simply went outside and stared at the night sky, with a full moon staring back at him like a giant blind eye, a few meters away from him. The lone sleeper of the convoy was busy applying black venom to whatever bullets Sergeant Jur's soldiers had left. He was also doing the same to his arrows. Suddenly curious, Sunny called out to the young man.
Hey you, what do you think? Will we make it?
The sleeper looked up at him with wide eyes. He was apparently not expecting to be addressed by the captain.
Sir, yes, sir, without a doubt, sir.
Sunny chuckled.
Spirit, oh right, I was meaning to ask, what's your name anyway?
The sleeper stared at him blankly for a few moments, then looked down and whispered under his breath, "Goddammit, what the hell, really?"
Sunny frowned and asked what that was. The sleeper flinched.
Oh, sorry, sir, it's just that I've already told you my name like 20 times. It's my flaw, sir. Everyone seems to forget.
Sunny scratched the back of his head and conceded, "Well, all right, never mind."
What a strange flaw, not the worst one to have, though.
He left the sleeper alone and walked forward, stopping in front of the Rhino and looking ahead. Then, he started stretching his muscles. The road ahead was desolate and enveloped in darkness.
This is going to be a wild ride.
The small convoy turned west, rolling down a narrow road that descended from the mountains and eventually met the coastal highway. The Rhino was moving at the front of the column, with 4 remaining civilian transports following it and the 3 battered military vehicles guarding the rear. This was Sunny's siege army for the next 6 hours or so. The 3 armored vehicles at Sergeant Jur's disposal still had some ammunition left, just barely enough to last them the rest of the way to Erebus Field, provided that their charge across the highway would be as dire as Sunny anticipated. The civilian transports weren't only flimsy, but also lacked any kind of integrated defense systems to ward off the attacking nightmare creatures. However, they were protected by something far more lethal: the irregulars. Samara was already setting up her rifle in an improvised gun nest on the roof of the rearmost transport, to allow the awakened sharpshooter complete freedom in picking off targets from distance. Quentin was by her side, his sword and shield ready to strike down any nightmare creature that would dare to get too close. Kim was on the roof of the next vehicle, with a dozen magazines of charged rounds prepared in advance for her carbine. The nameless sleeper was keeping her company with a bow and a quiver of poisoned arrows. Bell and Dorn were protecting the last two transports. Both had memories capable of ranged attacks, but neither was a proficient marksman. Their main job was to prevent abominations from attacking the refugees directly. So, knowing that they would probably have to move around the roofs of their assigned vehicles a lot, the two fighters had neglected modifying the vehicles with any kinds of protective emplacements. All four transports had been prepared for the charge, as well as the soldiers could manage. There were plates of armor and alloy spikes welded to their sides, as well as makeshift rams attached to their fronts in a pale imitation of the Rhino. And lastly, there was the heavy APC itself. Since Saint was gone, Sonny was sitting on its roof instead, holding Morgan's warbow in his hands. Despite the howling of the chilling wind, he didn't feel cold at all, fueled by adrenaline. His body was encompassed by the dull steel of the Undying Chain, the dying wish hidden beneath its sleek breastplate. He was ready for battle, traverse the highway as fast as possible, killing anything before it had a chance to approach the convoy. That was the plan. Not that Sonny really expected everything to go according to it. Blackie and Abomination were running ahead of the column, serving as the vanguard and forward scouts, while Nightmare was still slumbering in the depths of his soul. The Dark Courser was already sufficiently healed to be summoned, but Sonny was holding back on calling upon him until things inevitably went south. Which Thale? I just know Thale. Descending the mountains was easier than trying to push through them, so it didn't take long for the convoy to reach the final stretch of the road before the coastal highway. The terrain had turned much smoother, and then entirely flat. Finally, the beams of light shooting from the Rhino illuminated the wide expanse of weathered concrete, and the dark waves rising and falling not too far behind it. The highway was wide enough for 10 APCs the size of the Rhino to drive side by side. But a section of it was separated from the main thoroughfare by a thick barrier. Behind it, closest to the mountain slopes, a railway stretched both north and south, meant to carry armored trains across the landmass. That still left them enough space to maneuver, but also placed the convoy closer to the ocean. The full moon shone in the black sky, drowning in the undulating lights of the ghostly aurora. The highway was utterly empty and basked in the pale moonlight, all of it. The dark slopes of the mountains, the wide expanse of the road, and the black waves beyond it looked eerie, ominous, and foreboding. However, Sonny had no time to appreciate the ambience. That was fast. A few hundred meters ahead, the two echoes had already caught the scent of nightmare creatures hiding in the darkness. Unfortunately for them, very few things could hide from Sonny's gaze in the gloom of the polar night. Even before Abomination had a chance to lunge at the dark shapes laying on the road, a black arrow fell from the sky, piercing the head, at least Sonny thought that it was the head, of a monstrous centipede that seemed to have been resting on the concrete.
You have slain an awakened beast.
A moment later, the echo's powerful jaws crunched on the chitinous carapace of a different abomination, while Blackie jumped on the third, trying to copy the ferocious attack of the larger hound. A second arrow helped him finish the job without slowing down. The Rhino plowed through the corpses of the massive centipedes, tearing them apart and clearing the way for the rest of the convoy. Sonny felt the APC vibrating as it gradually gained more and more speed. The coastal highway seemed to be in good shape despite the recent earthquake, so nothing was slowing them down. For now, at least, it seemed as though they had a chance of making it to Erebus Field in a timely fashion. However, he could already see more nightmare creatures in the distance, their frenzied eyes slowly igniting with dangerous flames as the lights and the noise of the convoy attracted their attention. There were unclear shapes moving on the slopes of the mountains, too, rising from the darkness and starting to descend toward the highway to intercept the column of human vehicles. Much more disturbingly, the black waves continued to murmur to the speeding convoy's left as they continuously assaulted the shore, coming and going without showing any sign of a harrowing threat hiding beneath their dark surface. That lack of movement filled Sonny with much more unease than the swiftly approaching silhouettes of murderous abominations.
Whatever it's that's going to show up, just show up already.
There was no response. Gritting his teeth, Sonny turned away from the ocean and raised his bow. There were all kinds of nightmare creatures who had apparently decided to take a nap on the flat concrete surface of the coastal highway. Bestial maws opened in vicious snarls, sharp mandibles dripping with viscous saliva, jagged claws, curving bone scythes, and various implements of death that Sunny didn't even know how to describe. All of it was flying toward the convoy, drawing closer and closer with each second. The faster the vehicles moved, the faster the abominations converged on them. Damnation. Sunny was standing on the vibrating roof of the Rhino, drawing Morgan's warbow time and time again. In a short span of time, he had let loose a veritable rain of arrows, slaughtering at least a dozen of the approaching nightmare creatures. His muscles were already protesting the unforgiving pace, but augmented with all four of his shadows. Sunny knew that he could keep the same rate of fire for much longer. The battle was only starting, anyway. Although the menagerie of monsters rushing toward the convoy seemed ghastly and dangerous, these were only the dregs of the chain of nightmares. They were the lone stragglers or small packs of abominations that had broken away from larger swarms and hordes, and as such, didn't pose a real threat, for now. They were also only attacking the column from the front. Very soon, Sunny and his people would be surrounded and forced to resist attacks from all directions, to postpone that. Samara finally opened fire. Most of the nightmare creatures on the highway were obscured from her by the other transports and the wide shape of the Rhino. But she had a clear shot of the mountain slopes and the abominations that were rushing down the treacherous surface of the icy stone to attack the convoy from the side. A shining slug flashed through the air, and one of the distant silhouettes ruptured, mangled remains sliding down the steep slope. Even before the echo of the first thunderous shot dissipated into the cold air, the powerful rifle was already humming with electrical whine once again, charging to spit another devastating round. I am not fast enough to kill all of them. For now, Sunny was conserving his essence. He was only using one of the active enchantments of his mighty bow, soul arrows, which didn't demand a lot of it. The dying wish was also inactive. For now, since there was no need to draw the attention of abominations away from the civilian transports yet, he considered summoning the strike of thunder for a moment, then decided against it. Their charge toward Erebus Field was going to be a marathon, not a sprint. They had to be frugal with how to spend their power and resources. Instead of laying waste to the approaching nightmare creatures with a strike of lightning, he picked the most threatening ones and concentrated on taking down these high-priority targets first. Abomination fearlessly dove into the mass of enemies, tearing them apart with ruthless determination. Since there were very few fallen creatures among this first wave, most were much weaker than the massive Echo. Blackie, however, was in danger of being slain if he wasn't careful. The smaller hound separated and dashed to the edge of the highway, concentrating on attacking the outliers of the rushing mob. So far, so good. Sunny killed most of the nightmare creatures that could seriously threaten the Rhino, but at that point, the APC was already only meters away from the swiftest of the attackers, moving at its top speed. The enormous bulk of the Rhino smashed into the lunging abomination, practically pulverizing it into a cloud of crimson haze. The second creature crashed on the concrete with an arrow in its eye. And then, the convoy was in the thick of the disorganized crowd of nightmare creatures. Some of them were quick enough to change direction and dash toward the civilian transports. The others were too slow and allowed the column to flash past, then wasted precious seconds to stop, turn around, and hurry to pursue the speeding vehicles. The turrets of the military vehicles barked, sending poisoned bullets toward those abominations that were fast enough to catch up with them, and ignoring the rest. It wasn't their goal, nor was it realistic to slaughter every single nightmare creature across 600 kilometers of the coastal highway. But then again, there was no need to. They only had to kill those that the convoy couldn't outrun. Samara continued to fire her rifle, choosing to concentrate on the more powerful targets, just like Sunny had on the next civilian transport. Kim was using her carbine to cut down those that managed to get close to the column, while the nameless sleeper was sending one arrow flying after another. Bell was using a small throwing hatchet that gruesomely sliced the abominations apart, and then magically returned to his hand. Dorn was armed with a set of iron javelins that seemed to hit much harder than they were supposed to. Even with his prodigious strength, the convoy cut through the first wave of nightmare creatures, leaving broken bodies and bleeding corpses behind. Its defenders continued their barrage, finishing off those nightmare creatures that were now gaining on the column from the back. Sonny rotated his shoulder and winced slightly, then knocked another arrow on the string of his bow and froze for a moment, peering into the distance. He tried to evaluate the situation. His face darkened.
It.
A few hundred meters ahead, a stream of nightmare creatures was spilling on the highway from the mountain slope, and ever further away, behind them, the whole width of the road was blocked by a dark mass of monstrous bodies. This time, it was a proper swarm, one of many they would have to fight their way through, most likely. Sonny studied the swarm for a split second, then quickly glanced at the ocean. At least the dark waves were calm, for now. With a contemptuous sigh, he sent the arrow flying in the direction of the mountain slope, and then drew his bow again. This time, his fingers were illuminated by the furious light of a caged lightning. As soon as the strike of thunder flashed through the darkness of the polar night and burst into blinding arcs of electricity, decimating the center of the swarm, Sonny spoke into his communication device, calling for a wedge formation. He had created a rift in the middle of the mass of nightmare creatures, but it wasn't enough to clear a path through the blockade. There was the flanking force spilling from the mountains to worry about, too. The abominations were already dashing toward the convoy, bits of broken cement flying from beneath their sharp claws. The fastest and strongest one, however, suddenly collapsed, a golden arrow piercing its throat. Behind the Rhino, 2 military vehicles and 2 civilian transports accelerated and left the column, assuming positions on both sides of the convoy. From above, it would have looked like a wedge with the APC taking the point, while the other 4 vehicles formed its wings. Purpose of that formation was very simple, with the massive shape of the Rhino not blocking their view of the road anymore. Both the military vehicles and the awakened on the roofs of the 2 civilian transports were free to target the swiftly approaching swarm. Samara's rifle thundered, and Kim's carbine cracked, sending a rain of bullets into the mass of abominations. 2 turrets joined the fray, clearing a path for the convoy to charge through. Sonny continued to let loose arrow after arrow, as well taking down the most threatening of nightmare creatures. Just a few moments before the column reached the swarm, the 4 vehicles veered back and returned to their positions, hiding behind the bulk of the speeding Rhino. The ram of the APC plunged into the mass of bodies, both dead and alive. With a violent shudder, pieces of flesh flew aside as it cleaved a bloody trail through the mob of nightmare creatures, allowing the rest of the convoy to follow. They made it through, even if just barely. Sonny muttered under his breath as they plunged in. However, all wasn't well. More than a few abominations managed to lunge at the lead vehicles from the sides. 2 or 3 were clinging to the front of the Rhino, and several more had crashed into the Bells and Dorn's civilian transports. Their claws were already tearing into the alloy. The more heavily armored Rhino received a few ugly scars, but was still holding. Sonny swiftly drew his bow, finishing off the unwanted passengers. Behind him, Bell dashed toward the edge of the transport's roof and struck down with his hatchet, severing the abomination's limb before it had a chance to rip through the makeshift plate of armor and allow the beast to climb inside. There was a nightmare creature on the other side of the transport, but its body had been caught by the spikes welded along the frame of the civilian vehicle, so it didn't manage to rip through the hull before one of Dorn's javelins took it down. The giant man himself dealt with an abomination that had leaped at his transports by pulling it down mid-jump with his aspect ability. The creature hit the cement surface of the road instead of crushing into the side of the vehicle, and was promptly crushed by its wheels. The weight of the transport loaded with close to 100 people wasn't enough to kill an awakened monster. However, so although it was severely injured, the abomination still tried to get up before it could. The next transport rolled over it, and then the next, ending the creature's life in a string of sickening crunches. Just a few moments after crashing into the swarm, the convoy was through. The turrets of the military vehicles instantly turned around, unleashing a barrage of bullets at the fastest of pursuing nightmare creatures. Samara's tungsten rounds and Sonny's arrows took care of the most resilient of the enemies, while Kim was hurriedly reloading her carbine. The nameless sleeper had almost emptied his quiver, so he was busy summoning the spent arrows back. The thinned-out swarm was falling behind. But there were already new enemies appearing from the darkness ahead, letting out a frustrated sigh. Sunny spun to face north again and drew his bow.
This is going to get old fast.
Surrounded by bloodshed, the convoy continued to devour kilometers as it sped across the wide highway. The battle never really stopped, instead stretching into one continuous, moving slaughterhouse, even if there hadn't been too many nightmare creatures near the coast at the start. The lights and noise of the charging column mixed with the smell of fresh blood, attracting more and more of them from the mountains. All that ever changed was the intensity of combat. Sometimes the defenders of the convoy only had to repel disorganized mobs of strugglers, killing them off before the abominations could launch an attack on the vehicles. Sometimes a true swarm would appear to block off the road, forcing them to fight their way through while sustaining minor damage and desperately trying to prevent anything from getting to the refugees. Despite it all, the vehicles were in a good enough shape to remain operational. For now, the Rhino was covered in scars, and its ram, as well as the whole front section, had turned slick with blood, making it look like an infernal machine of morbid carnage. The civilian transports had chunks of flesh stuck on their spikes, with deep grooves left behind by the claws of abominations decorating their sides. The barrels of the turrets on the military vehicles were glowing red, steaming as the chilling darkness of the polar night cooled them down. The people were starting to get tired, but prepared to give it their all to reach the destination, continued to perform their duties with stubborn determination. The highway itself was changing. As well, the further north they moved, the more nightmare creatures and the more signs of sustained damage there were. Wide cracks appeared in the concrete, and the column had to maneuver around broken vehicles and carcasses of massive abominations from time to time, the latter picked clean to the bone by other monsters. Killing the enemies before they reached the column was getting harder and harder because of these obstacles. At some point, Sunny tensed as he noticed an especially troublesome obstruction blocking off the road ahead. His face darkened.
What now?
Still some distance from the convoy, the whole width of the highway was blocked off by something that looked like a tall wall of alloy. It was surrounded by a scene of pure mayhem, with torn pieces of metal and massive chunks of concrete laying on the road in a chaotic mess. Sunny scowled, trying to make sense of what he saw. After a second or two, he uttered a silent curse. Ahead of them, the barrier between the thoroughfare and the railroad was shattered to pieces. The object he had thought to be an alloy wall was actually the roof of a train carriage laying on its side. One of the armored behemoths must have been derailed here at some point in the past, turning a whole section of the highway into a nightmare of broken concrete and mangled alloy.
Damnation.
Sunny had ridden an armored train once before, so he knew how fearsome these moving fortresses were. What could have even destroyed an alloy beast like that? He wasn't sure that an earthquake would be enough to derail one of them, even though it was the most reasonable theory he had. In any case, Sunny had more pressing problems than guessing the fate of the crashed train. The convoy wasn't allowed to slow down. The fragile equilibrium they had been able to create was all dependent on the assumption that the column would keep moving. If they lost speed or, even worse, were forced to stop, there would be no escape from death. They would simply drown in nightmare creatures.
Sam and Quentin make the echoes fall back to the Rhino.
Then, he closed his eyes for a moment and reached forward with his senses. After becoming a master and before coming to Antarctica, Sunny had received no opportunities to test the limits of shadow manifestation in combat. Now, he knew that his ascended ability was more powerful than he had thought, so he was going to call upon it again, before the convoy reached the wreckage. The shadows on the slope of the mountain came to life and flowed forward, forming long tentacles. These tentacles tore through the alloy of the overturned carriage, taking hold of it, and then pulled the massive structure aside. A deafening sound of metal scraping against concrete filled the air.
Come on, come on.
The carriage was moved just far enough to create an opening for the approaching Rhino. The APC pulverized several chunks of the concrete barrier with its ram, clearing the road, then maneuvered to the side and slid past the mangled alloy structure. Behind it, the highway was revealed to be in terrible condition, so it took a lot of skill to navigate the Rhino past the mess of broken metal. Luster was just the man to do it, though. He masterfully avoided all the serious obstacles and rammed through those that could be destroyed without ever slowing down. The rest of the vehicles weren't as large as the APC, so it wasn't too hard for them to follow. Several abominations crawled from the wreckage to lunge at the convoy, but were swiftly pierced by arrows and poisoned bullets. Soon, the convoy left the field of debris, but instead of being relieved, Sonny only gritted his teeth, obscured by the remains of the armored train. There was another swarm of nightmare creatures ahead of them, this one much larger and dangerous than all the previous ones. Worse still, since they were late to discover it, there wasn't much time to thin the abominations out with ranged attacks. The convoy was under real threat. Sonny cursed through gritted teeth. "Got him it." Sonny briefly glanced at the black bow in his hands, knowing that just its power alone wasn't going to be enough this time. The situation was dire, which meant that it was time to call the cavalry. He considered summoning Nightmare near the Rhino and stylishly jumping into the saddle from the roof, like he had seen cool heroes do in webtoons, but then decided against such theatrics. It wasn't that Sonny wasn't capable of landing on the back of a galloping horse from a moving vehicle. It was just that Nightmare's saddle was a memory, and had to be hoisted on the black steed by hand each time he was summoned. By now, Sonny was capable of riding his horse without a saddle, but using any kind of melee weapon effectively without stirrups was more or less out of the question. Stirrups were essential to mounted combat. Insignificant as they might seem, he sighed.
I guess I am just not cool.
With that, Sonny summoned Nightmare directly onto the roof of the Rhino, simultaneously calling upon the Sin of Solace and the overpriced saddle. Soon, the fearsome black stallion was standing in front of him, looking forward with ferocious crimson flames burning in his eyes. Nightmare snarled, revealing 2 rows of metal fangs that resembled those of a wolf. It seemed that he had plenty of sleep, and now hungered to tear some abominations apart. Moonlight glinted on the dark surface of the courser's adamantine horns.
Don't you worry, I'll get a chance to rampage in just a few moments.
Sonny swiftly put the saddle on the courser's sable back, fastening it into place. Just at that moment, Samara's rifle barked, sending a shining round flashing into the darkness. A chorus of bestial howls was the reply. He cursed, grabbed the hilt of the Sin of Solace, and jumped into the saddle. Sonny closed his eyes for a moment, sensing insidious whispers assault his mind. Today, they seemed especially clear. He took a deep breath, then looked forward and sent Nightmare charging. The black steed lunged forward, jumping from the roof of the Rhino in a tall arc. Inside the APC, Luster flinched as adamantine hooves thundered right above his head, and then craned his neck to stare at the swift shape of the leaping steed.
What the hell?
He paused for a moment, and then added in a stifled voice,
"Oh, damn majestic."
Plummeting toward the mass of abominations, Sonny gripped the hilt of the Sin of Solace tighter and poured essence into the dying wish, activating its soul enchantment.
Let's teach these bastards the meaning of true fear, Nightmare.
Nightmare landed on the surface of the highway less than 100 meters away from the rushing swarm and galloped forward without ever slowing down. The wind howled in Sonny's ears as the dark stallion's adamantine hooves rang sonorously on the cold concrete. A vicious grin somehow found its way to Sonny's face, and he muttered to himself that he must have lost his mind. Diving headlong into a tide of hundreds of nightmare creatures was no cause for a smile, but for some reason, he felt exhilarated. Perhaps it was the sinister whispers of the cursed jade sword that were subtly influencing him. Perhaps Nightmare was simply not the only one who longed to go on a murderous rampage. Ever since Low 49, nothing had gone right for Sonny. The bitter pressure of it all fueled him with frustration and anger, and the anger wished for a way out. Now, he was going to unleash it on these damned abominations.
Uday.
Nightmare landed on the surface of the highway less than 100 meters away from the rushing swarm and galloped forward without ever slowing down. The wind howled in Sunny's ears as the dark stallion's adamantine hooves rang sonorously on the cold concrete. A vicious grin somehow found its way to Sunny's face, and he muttered to himself that he must have lost his mind. Diving headlong into a tide of hundreds of nightmare creatures was no cause for a smile, but for some reason he felt exhilarated. Perhaps it was the sinister whispers of the cursed jade sword that were subtly influencing him. Perhaps Nightmare was simply not the only one who longed to go on a murderous rampage. Ever since Low 49, nothing had gone right for Sunny. The bitter pressure of it all fueled him with frustration and anger, and the anger wished for a way out. Now, he was going to unleash it on these damned abominations. On a dark, desolate highway, a black steed and its bleak rider emerged from the shadows. Adamantine hooves rang on concrete as they flew forward through the falling snow, soon catching up with a small column of battered vehicles, overtaking one transport after another. Sunny briefly evaluated their condition. The convoy was roughly halfway to its destination, and none of the vehicles had failed, yet each looked as if it had gone through a meat grinder. But whatever the technicians had done to the transports was still keeping them from breaking down on the road. Hopefully, that would continue to be the case. His soldiers were doing a good job of warding off the nightmare creatures. As well, nothing had managed to attack the column in his absence. The refugees were all intact. Glancing at the military vehicles, Sunny sent a short communication to Jeer.
How much ammo do you've left, Sergeant?
On a dark, desolate highway, a black steed and its bleak rider emerged from the shadows. Adamantine hooves rang on concrete as they flew forward through the falling snow, soon catching up with a small column of battered vehicles, overtaking one transport after another. Sunny briefly evaluated their condition. The convoy was roughly halfway to its destination, and none of the vehicles had failed, yet each looked as if it had gone through a meat grinder. But whatever the technicians had done to the transports was still keeping them from breaking down on the road. Hopefully, that would continue to be the case. His soldiers were doing a good job of warding off the nightmare creatures. As well, nothing had managed to attack the column in his absence. The refugees were all intact. Glancing at the military vehicles, Sunny sent a short communication to Jeer.
How the hell do I deal with that thing?
There was still almost a minute left before they would reach the gate and its guardian, so that was how long he had to come up with a solution. Sunny swiftly considered his best options. He could send Nightmare charging forward and attack the tyrant with his most powerful weapon, the Sin of Solace, to either cripple, kill, or lead the creature away from the road, depending on the rank of the giant spider. That could either be a very good or an utterly terrible decision. Alternatively, he could summon his bow and finally use the wasteful but devastating Death Dealer enchantment, potentially delivering a severe wound or outright killing the tyrant on the spot. The minions could be dealt with if he followed up with the Strike of Thunder, too. But if that didn't work, he would be risking the entire convoy. He spat a curse. Sunny almost commanded Nightmare to rush toward the tyrant, but at that moment, something strange happened. The giant spider, who had been staring at the approaching human vehicles with malevolent intensity, suddenly froze for a moment, and then took a step back. Then, the creature turned around and rushed toward the mountain, climbing the slope with its long, powerful legs just a few seconds later. It was far away from the highway and continuing to get further, large boulders rolling down from where it had passed. It was almost as if the tyrant was scurrying away. Sunny blinked, dumbstruck by the unexpected turn of events. In front of him, the highway was empty, with only the pulsating rift of the gate obstructing its middle section. He muttered under his breath, bewildered. Why did it look as though the tyrant was running from something? Before Sunny could digest the new information, a cold shiver suddenly ran down his spine, and his hair almost stood on end. A sense of danger and fear like he had never experienced before suddenly burst into his mind, swinging his head to stare at the ocean, his eyes wide. Sunny felt a colossal shadow rising from the depths of the cold water. The waves retreated a few meters back, and then a titanic stone hand suddenly broke the surface and soared into the night sky. The arm of the submerged giant rose above the coastal highway like a dark tower, easily reaching 20 or 30 meters into the air. and then careened, starting to fall in the direction of the convoy. Sunny froze, mesmerized by the harrowing sight of a dark expanse of weathered stone rising from the depths of the ocean. It rose higher and higher, rivers of water flowing down from the numerous grooves and ravines covering the surface of the giant's arm. Due to the scale, it seemed as though the arm was moving deceptively slowly. But he knew that to be an illusion. A single thought formed in Sunny's stunned mind.
Goliath.
One of the 3 titans that had come to the Antarctic center. It had to be him. The Whispering Legion was dead, and the winter beast prowled somewhere far to the north. The last one, stone giant Goliath, had disappeared without a trace. Army Command had no accurate data on his current location. The last time Sunny had been in contact with them. No wonder if the missing titan had been traveling through the shallows off the coast of the landmass. A moment later, Sunny suddenly came to his senses, shrugging off the dread and awe of witnessing the enormous creature, or rather, one of its limbs. What was the big deal anyway? The Goliath was a runt as far as titans were concerned. He was simply a giant stone abomination instead of a sentient force of nature. Even then, Sunny had seen far greater beings before. He muttered that it was just a damn fallen titan. However, the damned titan, no matter how he compared to others of his kind, could destroy the convoy with one brush of his finger, barely suppressing his panic. Sunny stared at the falling hand of the giant, then twisted around and waved at Luster, shouting as loud as he could.
Go, 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 and speed up.
If there was one blessing in this dreadful situation, it was that Goliath's aim seemed to be a bit off. If the convoy accelerated, they had a slim chance of shooting underneath the gargantuan arm before it slammed into the highway. Should they end up being just a little bit too slow, at least a couple of vehicles would be instantly flattened by the titanic blow, but stopping meant death. So there was no other choice. The Rhino dashed forward, gaining a bit more speed. Sunny and Nightmare galloped ahead of it, diving into the shadow of the swiftly falling hand and emerging from it on the other side. The APC was just behind them. Sunny's heart was beating wildly as he counted off seconds. The first of the civilian transports appeared behind him, then another, and another. He whispered under his breath, "Not yet, not yet." Finally, the rear vehicle shot past the gate. A few moments later, Goliath's arm hit the concrete surface of the highway, pulverizing a large swath of it and sending a localized earthquake spreading from the point of impact. Nightmare stumbled, but righted himself a split second later, some distance behind. The wheels of the rearmost military vehicle momentarily flew into the air, then hit the cracked surface of the road with a screeching sound. Somehow, the driver managed to maintain control of the vehicle and desperately sped forward. Hoping to get away from the colossal threat, Sunny let out a groan, knowing that their narrow escape from death was both temporary and futile. No matter how fast the convoy was moving, they had no hope of outrunning a titan. Now that Goliath was aiming for them, there was no chance of salvation. He breathed out that they had made it, unless something managed to stall the giant for a few minutes. The convoy was doomed.
Not fair, not fair, this isn't fair.
After all they had been through, after everything he had done, this was the end. Sunny felt like howling at the moon in sorrow and anger. Behind them, the enormous hand scraped against the concrete, and then a titanic shape started to rise from the ocean. Goliath was pulling himself out of the cold water, its ugly head emerging from beneath the waves first. Sunny shuddered. The titan was somewhat humanoid in appearance, but far from resembling a graceful statue. Unlike the magnificent monuments of the Forgotten Shore, Goliath looked more like a small mountain that had come to life than an effigy of a human. The surface of its body was rough and unpolished, like a natural cliff, and its proportions were all wrong. His legs were powerful and stocky, and its torso was massive and asymmetrical, with mounds of stone rising from its back like humps. The giant had 3 arms, each hand possessing a different number of thick, short fingers. His head was like a misshapen hill of brown rock, with 2 cavernous holes gaping in it, drowned by darkness, and a single circular eye set deep in the center of his forehead. At least Sunny thought that it was an eye. The thing was milky white and round, but seemed to be cut of stone, like the rest of the titan's body. The thought of being gazed upon by the giant eye made him feel a deep sense of primal terror, or rather, even more of it. Sunny knew that the convoy had no hope of escaping the Titan, but they still had to try. The column sped up as much as it could, the battered vehicles burning through whatever they had left to distance themselves from the terrible monstrosity. The turrets unleashed a barrage of bullets, which hit the weathered stone of the Titan's body in twisting streams. However, their impacts were like mosquito bites to the giant. Less than, even, mosquitoes could break the skin of their prey, at least. Goliath climbed onto the highway, his massive shape barely fitting between the mountains and the ocean. Countless waterfalls continued to stream off his body, falling down and forming a pool in the obliterated section of the road. The Titan's single eye moved, locking on the escaping convoy, and then the creature took a step forward. The whole world seemed to tremble from the terrible weight of Goliath's massive foot. Just with this single step, the damned giant covered a lion's share of distance between him and the desperately speeding convoy. Whatever hope of escape Sunny had left was instantly shattered. He cursed the Titan under his breath. He stared at the towering shape of Goliath for a few seconds, his pale face full of dark resentment. Then, Sunny turned Nightmare around and dashed past the convoy, charging directly at the fearsome Titan. Because of how close they were to an active gate, the internal communications barely worked across the convoy. However, Sunny had been prepared for something like that. Translating his thoughts to the extraordinary rock, he sent a short message to Luster.
No matter what happens, continue forward and don't slow down. I'll catch up with the convoy later, hopefully.
He shot past the column of vehicles, heading in an entirely wrong direction. What kind of madman would be riding toward a fallen Titan? Sunny only had enough time to notice frightened expressions on the faces of the irregulars, who stared at his flashing silhouette in shock. And then the convoy was somewhere behind him, getting further and further away. The towering shape of Goliath, on the other hand, was drawing closer, looking at the approaching Titan. Sunny shivered. He murmured, wondering if he could kill a Titan. He was honestly not sure. One thing he did know, though, was that he wouldn't be able to kill this particular Titan. If Sunny had time to study Goliath, learn his weaknesses, and prepare, then things might have been different. But Army Command knew very little about the stone monstrosity, and so he knew even less if the two of them fought to the death. There was no question of who would end up dying, luckily. Sunny didn't have to make a heroic last stand. He was no hero and had no plans of being killed anytime soon, and so his goal wasn't to destroy the colossal creature. He just wanted to slow the big bastard down. If the convoy was given time to get away, there was a good chance that Goliath wouldn't follow them. A bit further north, a long stretch of the highway was built under overhanging cliffs, so the giant's enormous size would become a hindrance. Unless Goliath was ready to smash through many kilometers of solid rock or dive back into the ocean, he was going to have trouble keeping up with the swift vehicles. And even if he was ready to wreck the whole mountain range, that would also slow him down. A few minutes. Sunny just had to buy the convoy a few minutes. He wondered how the hell he was supposed to stop a Titan for a few minutes. Though, Nightmare stopped in the middle of the road, dwarfed by the nearing silhouette of Goliath. Sunny stared at the stone giant, shivering as he felt the inhuman gaze fall on him in return. The weight of it was almost palpable, pressing him down like an echo of the crushing. There was a stretch of the quaking highway left between them, but with the creature's colossal height, it was going to be covered in just a few steps. Sunny took a deep breath, and then forced his wildly beating heart to calm down. Jumping off his steed, he walked a small distance forward and stopped, his face full of defiant spitefulness.
You really shouldn't have done this during the night, blockhead.
With that, he sent his essence forward, on the slopes of the mountains and on the dark ribbon of the ocean shore. The mass of shadows moved, coming to life. Then, a thick black chain shot from the darkness, wrapping itself around one of the Titan's arms. It was followed by another, and another. Dozens of dark chains flew from the ground, the mountain slope, and the edge of the coast, shackling Goliath's arms and legs. Sunny was utterly focused, his eyes drowned by deep shadow. His essence surged and flowed like a tide, saturating the deep darkness of the polar night. He was burning through all of it without looking back, knowing that nothing less would be enough for the impossible task. Fortunately, if there was one thing he knew all about, it was chains, both literal and metaphorical. He might haven't learned how to escape every chain just yet, but he had learned about being bound a long time ago. At first, Goliath didn't seem burdened by the shadow chains at all. He continued moving forward, dragging them along. He didn't even show a sign of noticing them. However, Sunny wasn't done. A crooked grin appeared on his pale face, and suddenly, it seemed as though the night itself had come to life. Countless chains shot toward the towering titan, binding his limbs. Where there were dozens, there were now hundreds. Sunny felt as if his brain was on fire, and wasn't quite sure how he was managing to keep this many manifested shadows shaped, tangible, and strong at the same time. But he was doing it, and more than that. New chains appeared from the darkness every second. Goliath looked like he was carrying a forest of them on his body, anchored to the ground so thoroughly that, finally, the Titan's march slowed down, just a little bit at first, but then more and more. The towering monstrosity lowered his torso and pushed forward, a hint of irritation appearing in his bearing. But the more he pushed forward, the more the chains held him back, and there were new ones appearing every moment, wrapping themselves around him like snakes. In the end, the Titan came to a stop just a few dozen meters away from Sunny, less than a step, bent low and utterly immobilized. The shadow chains groaned, cracking as if on the verge of snapping, but held from the side. It looked as if the giant was trying to kneel in front of a defiant ant. Sunny let out a shaky breath, and then swayed slightly, feeling drops of blood falling from his nose. His essence was disappearing at a terrible rate. At this point, he wouldn't be able to sustain the hundreds of shadow chains for long, but no matter how much time that was going to buy, it was already enough, probably. His mind was somewhat hazy. He thought that he had overdone it this time. And when had the whispers of the Sin of Solace gotten so loud? Right now, Sunny felt like he could make out what they were saying. No, he definitely could. The cursed sword whispered into his ear, its voice indistinguishable from his own. It only said one word: useless. Sunny's eyes widened slightly. In the next moment, dozens of chains wrapped around one of Goliath's legs snapped with a deafening crack. He let out a small sound of dismay. The Titan's foot shot forward with astonishing speed and smashed into Sunny with the weight of a mountain. There was the howling of the wind and indescribable pain, but mercifully, it didn't last long. Then, there was only darkness. Sunny died. Being dead wasn't too bad, all things considered. More or less every bone in his body was shattered. His rib cage had caved in, and sharp bone fragments were piercing his lungs. His limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, and his skull had cracked. There was excruciating pain, but it went away almost immediately, since his spine was broken, and his spinal cord was severed. Bone weave had tempered his bones and made them incredibly durable. But everything had its limits. For Sunny, that limit had turned out to be being kicked by a literal mountain. Apparently, he couldn't see anything because his eyes had burst, and couldn't hear anything because his eardrums had ruptured. The world was dark and silent. It was almost comfortable, if not for the terrible cold. Sunny was very, very cold. Could he not just die in peace? Sunny let out a bitter groan of damnation.
You really are a useless piece of outskirt trash.
Despite not being able to hear anything, he heard the cold, contemptuous voice, his own voice.
Gods, can you shut the hell up?
Sunny sent his shadow sense outward and found out that his broken body was laying on the very edge of the dark water, with icy waves washing his blood off the stone shore and licking his skin. No wonder he felt cold. Goliath was nowhere to be seen. But the weakening tremors that shook the world from time to time told him that the Titan was walking away, heading inland, unable to move. Sunny imagined letting out a sigh.
What luck.
He might have died, but at least the giant hadn't stepped on him. His body had stopped just outside the dark waves after flying away and ricocheting off the concrete surface of the highway. Otherwise, to add insult to injury, he would have had to drown as well, but since he hadn't, now, it was time to come back to life. Sunny was dead, but of course, such trivialities weren't going to stop him. He hadn't spent most of the Antarctica campaign wearing the Undying Chain without a reason. After all, Undying enchantment description. The wearer can't die. He muttered that this was going to hurt. As long as he had essence to spare, death was just a temporary condition for Sunny. It was no different from having his head cut off in the Red Colosseum, and he had survived that debacle without too much trouble. Simply being unable to die for a few minutes wasn't going to save him. Sadly, back then, Sunny had been healed by Elias before running out of essence, but now there was no one to help him. As soon as he burned through his essence, he would inevitably die.
Well, I'll just help myself then.
Sunny summoned the runes. He didn't have eyes anymore, and yet he was still able to perceive them. Somehow, it was both strange and logical, explaining how Cassie had been able to communicate with the spell all that time. Finding the dying wish in the list of his memories, he concentrated on it and read the description of the transcendent charm's soul enchantment.
Death Wish Enchantment Description. Those who witness the wielder of this memory are compelled, friends to be inspired, foes to seek the wielder out. The power of the memory grows the more enemies they give the gift of death, and can be consumed to heal the wielder's wounds. Death charge 1,000.
Sunny hadn't been idle since coming to Antarctica. He had saturated the counter of the dying wish a long time ago by slaughtering countless nightmare creatures across the Antarctic center. Now, it was finally time to use that hidden ace, feeling his essence running dry and a numbing fog enveloping his mind. Sunny activated the healing enchantment. Instantly, there was a change. A furious flood of power rushed into his broken body, repairing it. His eardrums were restored. His liquefied eyes slowly started to coalesce back into solid shape. His fractured bones assembled themselves from hundreds of small fragments. The severed sections of his spinal cord connected back together.
Larg and crap.
The pain was back, sending him into a violent convulsion. Sunny bit his tongue hard enough to feel the salty taste of blood, but a moment later, that wound, too, was healed. The agony of it all was nothing short of exquisite, but it was all good. Pain was good. Pain meant that he was alive, or at least coming back to life. It was its absence that was frightening. He cursed it through gritted teeth. A full charge of the powerful transcendent memory was enough to bring his body back from being utterly devastated. But the process wasn't instantaneous. Even with blood weave helping, it took some time. Sunny had no choice but to endure and wait. He was no stranger to agony anyway. At some point, he regained his vision, raising his head weakly. Sunny looked at himself through the veil of tears. What he saw made him feel disheartened. The Undying Chain was all but gone. The bleak steel of his armor was shattered and mangled to the point of being unrecognizable. A few pieces of it were bent at sharp angles and pierced his flesh, slowing down the process of healing. Sunny stared at the bloody mess that was his body for a few moments, then thought that he should probably dismiss the armor. However, he didn't need to. Almost at the same moment, the Undying Chain suddenly shone with soft radiance, and then disintegrated into a whirlwind of white sparks. The brilliant sparks danced around him for a few seconds, caressing his skin before disappearing without a trace. Forever, the familiar voice of the spell whispered into his ear.
Your memory has been destroyed.
Sunny dropped his head back into the water.
Oh, thank you.
The Undying Chain had held long enough for the healing power of the dying wish to bring him back from the doors of death, refusing to succumb to the terrible damage before he was safely on his way to being healed, as if on purpose, true to its name to the very end. It was sort of poetic.
I guess dying makes one sentimental.
What the hell was he thinking about? It was just a suit of armor, an armor-type memory. Memories didn't have thoughts, aspirations, and feelings. Well, most didn't, turning his head slightly. Sunny stared at the beautiful jade shape of the Sin of Solace, which was laying on the stones a few steps away from him. His eyes darkened a little.
So it was you, all that time, messing with my mind and calling me names.
The moonlight glinted on the pristine white blade. Everything was silent for a few moments, and then Sunny's own voice answered, full of disdain.
Took you long enough to realize, as expected of an uneducated rat.
Sunny gritted his teeth and stifled the desire to dismiss the damned sword immediately. He had already lost his armor, and leaving himself without a weapon wouldn't be a very good decision. Ignoring the insidious whispers, Sunny let out a pained groan and then stood up with a stagger. He was all but naked, terribly fatigued, and suffering from extreme essence exhaustion. But he was also, undoubtedly, not dead. Sunny came back to life. Sunny stood on the shore of the ocean, shivering and considering if he should fall down and take a long, relaxing rest in the cold water. His reserves of essence were utterly spent, and with it came the sickening feeling of fragility and weakness. Awakened experienced a form of backlash when burning through all of their essence, but it was only a little bit harmful. The weakness would pass, and there would be no long-term harm done. He just had to weather the immediate consequence. The more concerning aspect of the situation was that he didn't even have enough essence to summon a single memory. Looking down at the threadbare rags of his once pristine black bodysuit, Sunny sighed. For now, that was all that separated him from the bitter cold and the chilling winds of Antarctica.
I need to get back to the convoy.
Trying to get his tired mind to work properly, Sunny hesitated for a moment.
But first, I need to check on Nightmare.
The stallion was nowhere to be seen, so he was afraid of what had happened to his steed. The runes were still shimmering in the air in front of Sunny, so he turned his attention back to them. Death charge, 0-1000. The charge of the dying wish was completely spent, but it had done its job. The undying chain was gone. Turning away from the list of memories with a sigh, he looked at the status of his shadows. The runes describing Nightmare shone as always, so the black steed wasn't destroyed.
Then where is he?
Sunny frowned, then softly hit himself on the forehead, remembering that he could simply check his innate connection to the shadow. Without wasting any time, he reached inward and tried to sense it within his soul. Soon, Sunny felt Nightmare's presence. The connection wasn't really meant to share information, but he could still tell that the black steed was nearby, and in the middle of a battle, the battle didn't seem dire or dangerous, though. The stallion was most likely dealing with stray nightmare creatures that could have attacked Sunny while he was still healing.
Good, then we can get away from here as soon as he's finished.
Sunny swayed a little, then glanced at his four shadows, who were all staring at him with different expressions. The happy shadow was beside itself, but strangely, the other three were also showing some degree of uncharacteristic positivity. Even the gloomy one appeared somewhat relieved. He grinned.
What did you think that a mere titan would be enough to get rid of me? Dream on.
With that, Sunny looked north, wondering how long it would take to catch up with the convoy, then took a couple steps forward and leaned down to pick up the Sin of Solace. The closer his fingers got to the jade hilt, the more it seemed as though the cursed sword was smiling ominously. He muttered a curse about the damned thing.
Behind you.
Sunny scoffed.
As if I would be gullible enough to.
At that moment, a swift shape shot through the darkness and collided with him. A tearing pain pierced Sunny's side, and he was sent flying into the water, hitting the dark surface with a pained scream. He scraped his hands on the cold stones beneath and rolled. Jumping to his feet a split second later, a handful of sharp rocks flew in the direction of the unknown attacker, meant to slow whoever it was down, however. The creature was still standing in the spot where Sunny had been a few moments ago, staring at him with inhuman eyes. Sunny staggered, briefly looking down. He saw that a sizable chunk of flesh was torn out of his side. Blood weave had stemmed the bleeding, but the wound still looked gruesome. Then, he glanced back at the bastard who had bitten him. The creature looked vaguely familiar. It was short, barely reaching Sunny's abdomen. With dark skin and bone plates covering its scrawny body like a suit of light armor, the damned goblin didn't look too formidable, but it had a wide mouth full of sharp, triangular teeth. It was also missing 2 fingers on its right hand. Sunny blinked a couple of times, remembering a tiny imp that he had once failed to finish off. The wretch had grown a lot since their last meeting. However, it was still on the smaller side, looking up. He noticed a lump of bleeding flesh in the abomination's mouth. His face contorted in anger. Sunny clenched his fists and opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, the scavenger seemed to grin spitefully, and then swallowed the lump of flesh with a look of pure hatred written on its ugly face. Sunny's eyes widened.
You wicked little shit.
He had let the imp go once, but the bastard didn't know his luck.
That's great, I'll just kill him now.
Full of fury, Sunny took a step forward but then staggered. The world suddenly turned hazy and his head spun.
What the?
His sides somehow both growing numb and burning with terrible pain. His body felt even weaker than before. Slowly looking down, He saw a strangely familiar black liquid flowing out of the gruesome wound. No, it was his blood which wasn't stopping. For some reason, the blood had simply turned black. His face paled.
Black venom.
How did he get poisoned with black venom? Sonny froze for a split second.
No way.
The abomination in front of him was a scavenger, a type of nightmare creature that inherited traits of that which it consumed. Had he feasted on the flesh of slain black tongues that the convoy had left floating in the mountain lake? Had the little bastard been following the convoy all that time, stuffing himself with all the corpses and carcasses that they had left behind, growing and waiting for a chance to avenge himself on Sonny? Suddenly, he wanted to laugh.
Bastard, you waited all that time, only to deliver yourself into my hands now.
Sonny took another step forward, commanding the shadows to wrap themselves around his body before he could, however. The scavenger suddenly dashed forward with tremendous speed, and a dreadful blow crashed into Sonny's abdomen. With the wind knocked out of him, he was thrown back and fell on his back. A split second later, the abomination was on top of Sonny. Two unexpectedly powerful hands wrapped around his neck, strangling him. A vicious, hateful snarl escaped from between the creature's bloodied teeth. Sonny's head was pushed beneath the surface of the waves, and ice-cold water instantly filled his mouth and nose. He tried to push the scavenger off, but his body was too weak to resist the furious fiend.
Wait and wait.
Before Sonny could come up with a single coherent thought, his consciousness started to fade, and a dangerous darkness encroached on his mind. And then, he got angry too.
Why is this happening to me twice in a row? What's this crap?
Sonny was being strangled and drowned, with his mutilated side on fire because of seawater getting into the ugly wound. The hateful scavenger had turned out to be astonishingly strong for his demure size. Or maybe it was Sonny who was too weak. He was utterly drained of essence, still recovering from being stomped on by a titan, and had a powerful toxin coursing through his veins on top of everything. After all, in any case, no matter how desperately he tried to shake the little bastard off his body, it was all in vain. The thought of surviving an encounter with a fallen titan, only to be killed by this pathetic waste of an abomination, made him feel bitter and slighted, especially because the damned gremlin was barely half his size. He let out a furious snarl of pain.
Just give up, your life is meaningless anyway.
Feeling his consciousness starting to slip, Sonny tried to snarl.
Shut the hell up.
The Sin of Solace remained silent for a moment, and then laughed.
It's amusing how desperately you are trying to survive, knowing that all that's waiting for you is a lifetime of being a slave.
That was the last drop. No, actually, being ambushed by the odious little goblin had been the last drop. After months of suffering setback after setback and enduring the stress of guiding men through a disastrous war campaign, having to restrain himself to project the image of a capable and composed leader, Sonny had finally had enough of it. Suddenly, he was very, very angry. He was positively furious. Sonny was furious at the world itself. But since the spiteful gremlin was the only creature near him, the bastard was going to have to be the sole target of his anger.
Get here, you wretched waif.
A sudden, sharp pain pierced Sonny's right hand. Luckily, the scrawny abomination was no Goliath. Boneweave might have surrendered to the titanic blow of the giant's stone foot, but it didn't give in to the scavenger's unreasonably sharp teeth. So, Sonny had kept his finger, even though it got cruelly mangled, not even noticing the pain. He grabbed the hateful gremlin's face, and then pressed his left thumb into the creature's eye as hard as he could. That, at least. Got a reaction. Shocked, the scavenger recoiled, and even if it was only for a moment, his grip on Sonny's neck weakened. That was all he needed, shifting beneath the abomination. Sonny managed to bend his knee, insert it between their bodies, and then throw the bastard away. The gluttonous goblin might have been far stronger than he had any business being, but he was still comparatively light. His scrawny body flew away, landing back on the stone shore.
Where do you think you are going? I am not finished with you yet, damned pest.
Rising from the water, Sonny sucked in a hoarse breath, and then glared at the scavenger with bloodshot, murderous eyes. The spiteful creature was happy to oblige. He jumped back to his feet and lunged forward, but then stumbled and grabbed his abdomen with a confused look. Sunny growled for it to come here. Sunny grinned.
What do you've a stomach ache?
That was probably blood weave doing its thing. Sunny's blood wasn't really poisonous, but it had a disturbing propensity of trying to return to its source when separated from it. So, swallowing a chunk of his flesh was almost like swallowing a handful of metal shavings, and then walking to stand in front of a powerful magnet. The bastard had to be in a world of pain.
No, not yet, he isn't.
Sunny dashed toward the vile goblin and used the momentary lapse in their battle to shift his vision and get a look at his enemy's soul. What he saw surprised him. The scavenger, who had started as a tiny pipsqueak of a nightmare creature, hadn't only grown many times its size physically, but also spiritually. Judging by the hideous darkness spreading through his soul, he was now a fallen demon. Sunny was pretty sure that the pathetic abomination he had failed to kill at low 49 was both of a lesser rank and a lower class, so it was a bit startling.
Well, no matter, he'll die all the same.
The two of them clashed at the edge of the water. The scavenger was strong, fast, and vicious, but Sunny was augmented by 4 shadows. Sadly, the augmentation of the shadows wasn't set in stone, instead enhancing his own physical state. And since his physical state was currently at the rock bottom, Sunny was still far away from being able to perform at his peak. Weakness multiplied by 5 might have transformed into a kind of strength, but not the sort he was used to. Still, he was both bigger and stronger than the feral gremlin. Even if the gap wasn't as large as it was supposed to be, the creature only had a slight advantage in speed. Wishing to crush the bastard with his own 2 hands, Sunny tried to grapple the scavenger and bring him to the ground. But the hateful imp managed to slip from his grasp at the last moment and lashed out with his maimed hand, delivering a vicious blow right into Sunny's wounded side. The explosion of pain made stars appear in his eyes. A strange wheezing sound escaped from between the abomination's sharp teeth, sounding almost like horse laughter.
Oh, you wretch.
Hissing, Sunny caught the abomination's arm and twisted it. The familiar sound of snapping bones made a smile appear on his face, but a moment later, it was replaced by a pained grimace, without skipping a beat after having his arm broken. The scavenger sunk his teeth into Sunny's forearm, making more blood splatter on the rocks and more venom enter his system.
Got him it.
Livid, Sunny slapped the scrawny fiend across the head, sending him flying away. Even before the abomination landed, he was already closing in, prepared to annihilate the little bastard, however. The scavenger just happened to fall on a very particular spot on the stone shore. His maimed hand ended up mere centimeters away from the hilt of the Sin of Solace, which was still laying on the wet rocks. The familiar voice laughed coldly.
Well, would you look at that, and what a turn of events.
Before Sunny could reach the evil goblin, the creature hurriedly reached forward, grabbed the cursed sword, and swung it fiercely in Sunny's direction. Sunny was too close to dodge the sudden strike, and the scavenger was too quick to let him. Even though the Sin of Solace was longer than his whole body, the little fiend managed to swing it fast enough to leave the enemy no time to retreat, knowing that the jade blade would easily cut him in half, or at least deliver a devastating wound. Sunny stared at the deadly white blur as it approached his torso. The time seemed to have slowed down.
What in the hell?
Without having to do anything, he simply dismissed the Sin of Solace. Instead of the lethal touch of the perfect jade, his skin was washed by a scattering of white sparks.
Is this a joke?
The gremlin blinked in confusion and then awkwardly clenched his fists, as if trying to understand where the sword he had been just holding went. In the next moment, Sunny kicked him in the chest, sending the abomination flying again, judging by the satisfying crunch he felt. The plate of bone armor on the scavenger's chest was broken, and very likely a few of his ribs, too. Best of all, the damned sword finally stopped talking. The wounded fiend bounced off the rocks, rolled a few meters, and then jumped to his feet. He didn't seem too wounded to not be able to continue the fight, and more than eager to, however. His expression was slightly pained, and before doing anything, the gremlin hit his head a few times. Sunny smiled. It seemed that the annoying whispers had done a number on the scavenger's mind. As well, now, all that was left was to finish the little menace off, preferably without losing any more pieces of flesh, or getting even more poison than he already was. Sunny just started to consider the best and most painful way to kill the scavenger. But at that moment, a beautiful sound reached his ears. It was the ringing of adamantine hooves that was approaching them from somewhere further up the road. A nasty grin appeared on his face.
"Oh, you are so done now, bastard."
Nightmare had obliterated his foes and was coming back to assist his master. The scavenger seemed to understand the meaning of the ringing, too. He hesitated, staring at Sunny with an expression of burning hatred. Then, something changed. The expression on the ugly face of the vicious gremlin shifted, turning into one of indescribable fear, moving his head. The little fiend stared at something behind Sunny's back, but there was nothing there.
"Time to die." Does this cretin really think that I will fall for the oldest trick in the book? I wrote that damn book, fool.
Except for the ocean. Then again, Sunny had already neglected to look behind himself once today, which had led to his current pitiful state. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine, with all four shadows wrapped around his body. Sunny couldn't see what was happening behind him. Gritting his teeth and knowing that he would regret it, he briefly glanced at the dark surface of the water. The ocean was just as it had been a minute ago, and no horror was lunging at him from the cold waves.
No.
By the time he looked back, the scavenger was already gone. Sunny didn't know where the little bastard had disappeared to, but he couldn't see any trace of him. It was as if the scavenger had never been here at all. A stunned expression appeared on Sunny's face.
Did he really slip away from me? Again. Oh, damnation.
Infuriated, Sunny kicked the nearest rock and then spun, hoping against reason to find the hateful gremlin. Somehow, he couldn't have gotten too far away or hidden too well. There was no telling just what sort of powers the hateful abomination had absorbed by devouring countless nightmare creatures, though the scavenger was thoroughly gone.
Can't believe it. Curse that damned wretch.
Gritting his teeth, Sunny sent his shadow sense outward, reaching as far as he could in the hope of discovering a hiding goblin. He didn't sense a scrawny shadow of the fiend anywhere. He did sense something else, however. Suddenly, Sunny felt very cold. Slowly turning around, he looked at the ocean again. The surface of the undulating waves was unchanged. But somewhere beneath it, at the very edge of his senses, he could feel shadows moving across the ocean floor, drawing closer and closer. Dozens, no, hundreds and hundreds of them, all heading toward a single point, him backing away. Sunny gulped.
Was the little wretch not faking after all?
What could have frightened the scavenger so much that he had chosen to abandon his attempt at murdering Sunny? Without a drop of essence in his cores and black venom coursing through his veins, Sunny didn't feel particularly keen to learn what horrors were approaching him from beneath the waves.
Lies better not find out.
He took a few more steps away and then turned around. Noticing a familiar shape, Nightmare appeared in his view, galloping across the shattered surface of the highway, following Sunny's command. The black stallion flashed past him without ever slowing down as he did. Sunny grabbed the hook of the saddle and pulled himself up, jumping on the back of the galloping steed. Together, they dashed away from the water, heading north as fast as they could, throughout all of it. Sunny never looked back, the feeling of cold dread he felt from the approaching shadows. It was eerily familiar.
To hell with this, to hell with it all. This is too damn much for one godforsaken day.
The silhouette of the dark courser and his half-naked, battered rider disappeared behind a bend of a mountain slope, and just a few seconds later, the dark waters parted, and the first of the eerie visitors stepped from the water onto the shore. Sunny was riding north through the bitter cold of the polar night, shivering in his raggedy, tattered bodysuit. The coastal highway stretched forward, strangely silent and empty. From time to time, he encountered bleeding carcasses of slain nightmare creatures that lay on the concrete, staring into the darkness with glassy eyes. Those were the only signs left behind by the passing of the convoy. The rest of the abominations must have been pulled away by it. Rushing in pursuit of the small column of vehicles, that gave Sonny a chance to catch his breath. Now that the thrill of the battle was gone, he found himself in a somber mood. The cold, dark, and desolate landscape of the Antarctic center was only adding to the gloom. Looking ahead, Sonny winced as he rocked in Nightmare's saddle. His wounds were hurting, and the lethal toxin was still trying to kill him from the inside. He sighed.
Laws, I am tired.
Most people would have been dead already, but Bloodweave was slowly overcoming the black venom. Sonny was still bleeding from the torn bite wounds on his side and his forearm, though his thumb was also a mess, since he hadn't encountered anything capable of making him bleed in a long while. That was a bit disconcerting. However, there was very little that Sonny could do. He had a mundane medkit stored inside the covetous coffer, but lacked the essence to summon it. He couldn't summon an armor to protect himself from the cold for the same reason. As well, after being completely exhausted, essence was slow to return to the vast reservoirs of his cores. What little he had received from dismissing the Sin of Solace was almost instantly absorbed by his essence-starved body, until his flesh was saturated at least to a small degree. He wasn't going to be able to summon any memory. It wasn't too bad, though. The more of the rejuvenating essence returned to his body, the better he was able to resist the cold, and the stronger Bloodweave became, slowly but surely. The feeling of sickening weakness permeating his whole being was receding. Then, a small trickle of essence flowed into his cores.
Finally.
Sonny commanded Nightmare to stop, and then dismounted. He knelt on the concrete for a minute or two, steadily breathing in and out and thinking about what memory he should summon first. He was cold and required armor to protect him from both the elements and the enemies, but he also felt very uncomfortable without a weapon. His wounds needed to be tended to, and the memory of ice was another worthy candidate. Eventually, he sighed.
Nightmare can be my weapon for now.
With that, Sonny summoned the covetous coffer, opening the metal chest. He took out a medkit and awkwardly applied the clotting agent to his wounds, then plastered the sealing patches on top of them. After that, he reached deep into the cavernous storage space of the coffer, searched for a bit, and pulled out a military coat. Sonny stared at the brass buttons on the coat for a few minutes, then put it on and raised the collar, hoping to save himself from the chilling wind. Climbing back into the saddle, he sent his steed forward. Nightmare went slowly at first, so as not to disturb his master's wounds too much. Sonny murmured.
That should do it for now.
They traveled in silence for some time. Eventually, Sonny recovered enough essence to summon another memory, choosing the cruel sight this time. He had considered calling upon the Sin of Solace, but then decided against it. His mood was already dark, and listening to the damned sword wasn't going to improve it one bit. Plus, with the Undying Chain gone, his mental defenses weren't as good as they had been. Sonny scowled when he remembered the loss of the transcendent armor, and hurried to throw the bitter thoughts out of his mind. It seemed that after subjecting him to all kinds of misfortune, Fated had finally decided to bestow Sonny with some luck. He hadn't encountered a single nightmare creature while traversing a long stretch of the highway. Eventually, though, that luck was bound to run out. Looking through the eyes of one of the shadows, which was scouting ahead, Sonny frowned. There was a dark mass of moving bodies blocking the road about a kilometer further north. The concrete was littered with corpses, and the abominations were feasting on the flesh of their fallen brethren, devouring them in a nauseating mess of squelching noises. As Sonny looked past the morbid feast, his eyes darkened. Soon, adamantine hooves rang on the concrete, and a nightmarish rider plunged into the mass of abominations. His steed stomped and tore them apart, and the shining spear of the rider himself flashed, making stark shadows dance on the surface of the highway, and streams of evaporating blood fountain into the cold air. It didn't take Sonny long to eviscerate the scavenging nightmare creatures. By then, he had recovered enough essence to channel it into the cruel sight, and by the time the short and brutal battle ended, he still had enough left to summon the mantle of the underworld. Finally, he wasn't cold anymore. His mood, however, only grew darker, out there behind the mass of dead nightmare creatures. both those who had been killed before he arrived and those he killed himself. The familiar shape of one of the civilian transports could be seen on the road, standing motionlessly. The lights of the vehicle were gone, and its frame was littered by deep gouges. Several large holes revealed the dark interior. Carcasses of the abominations were piled around the transport especially high, as if there had been a desperate fight around it. Sunny sighed, then walked over and climbed inside. Expecting to see the worst, however, there were no human bodies littering the interior. There was no blood, either, just emptiness and shards of broken glass.
What the hell happened here?
He lingered for a few moments, then returned outside and jumped into the saddle with a deep frown on his pale face, full of tension. Sunny sent Nightmare galloping north once again. This time, his posture was full of a sense of urgency. About an hour later, Sunny reached the spot where the convoy was supposed to leave the highway and turn inland, scaling the mountains once again to eventually reach Erebus Field. Of all the siege capitals in the Antarctic center, only the first and the largest one, Falcon Scott, was situated near water. Even then, the actual port was a separate and solitary fortress, connected to the city above it by a network of industrial elevators. The rest of the human strongholds were built away from the ocean, on the outskirts of the mountains, so the last stretch of the way was going to take the convoy away from the coast, if they continued on the route Sunny had planned for them. Of course, he had killed a few more nightmare creatures while trying to catch up with his men, and the corpses he had encountered seemed fresher as of late. From what Sunny could tell, the column wasn't too far ahead of him now, if he was lucky. He might even be able to rejoin the convoy before reaching Erebus Field. The siege capital had to be surrounded by a ring of active battle engagements, so Sunny really hoped to accompany the refugees through that mess.
No time to waste, then.
He commanded Nightmare to turn east, not long after they started to ascend the mountains. The snowfall seemed to pick up, making it harder to see. There was something strange about that snow, though.
What's this smell?
Frowning, Sunny raised a hand and caught a few snowflakes on his palm, while he could see in the dark. Differentiating colors that way wasn't his strongest suit. Sunny could instantly tell that something was wrong, though, because the white snowflakes didn't contrast against the onyx metal of his gauntlet nearly as much as they should have. In fact, they weren't white at all. He tilted his head a little, then smeared the snowflakes across his palm. What was left behind was a trail of black soot.
It's ash.
Looking up at the sky, he scowled. The strong snowfall was no snowfall at all. Instead, it was raining ash. Countless gray flakes fell from high above, dancing in the wind as they slowly obscured the world in a thick fog.
Well, that can't be good.
Full of bad premonitions, Sunny sent Nightmare into a gallop. They moved deeper into the mountains, following the twisted road. By now, Bloodweave had mostly dealt with the toxin, and his wounds were already healing. His essence was slowly being replenished. As well, so overall, Sunny was in relatively good shape. Not enough to face something truly dreadful yet, but well on the way.
Where the hell is my convoy?
Just as he thought that, the scouting shadows noticed something ahead, just short of the highest point of the nearest mountain pass, protected from the wind by tall cliffs. A group of battered vehicles was parked in a circle, with tired soldiers standing guard around it. He noticed Bell sitting on the roof of one of the transports, holding a sword in his hand. A sense of profound relief grasped Sunny's heart.
They're fine.
He let out a heavy breath and asked Nightmare to go faster. A few minutes later, the figure of an infernal rider clad in fearsome black armor entered the circle of light surrounding the parked convoy. The soldiers flinched and raised their rifles, aiming at the frightening apparition. Sunny raised a hand.
Don't shoot, bastards. What the hell is this, a mutiny?
The soldiers blinked a couple of times, staring at him with wide eyes. Then, someone yelled that it was the captain, that he was back. Thank the gods. Someone tell the devils. There was no need to inform the irregulars, though. Bell was the first one to notice him, and just a few moments later, the whole cohort emerged from the camp to meet him. Sunny jumped off the back of Nightmare, patted the stallion on the shoulder, and then dismissed him. Then, he turned to his people. Kim was the first one to speak.
Captain, you are alive. I mean, of course, you are. That rock of yours would have disappeared if you died.
Luster grinned and said, "See, I told you." Quentin glanced at him, then nodded with a smile.
We shouldn't have doubted the captain, indeed, but to be honest, sir, none of us believed that you would manage to stop a fallen titan, let alone live to tell the tale, all by yourself, no less. That's simply incredible. How did you even survive?
Sonny stared at him blankly for a few moments, then said evenly,
"Oh, I didn't."
As the members of the cohort looked at him with wide eyes, he scratched the back of his head and added,
"Being dead wasn't all it's cracked up to be, though, so I walked it off. Anyway, I found the empty transport on the highway. What the hell happened?"
The irregulars glanced at each other. Dorn sighed, then pointed to the convoy.
It broke down in the middle of the road, sir. We had to stop and transfer the refugees to the other 3 vehicles. The abominations didn't let's do it in peace. Of course, it was a hell of a fight, but in the end, we managed to get everyone loaded up safely. Broke through the crowd of nightmare creatures and fled. We lost a couple of soldiers, but none of the civilians were seriously hurt.
Sonny let out a heavy sigh. So, more people died. He closed his eyes for a moment, then asked what the situation was now. Dorn's face darkened.
The remaining transports are in bad shape and severely overloaded, sir. I don't think that they'll be able to travel for much longer.
That was to be expected. Sonny waved a hand.
"Are they going to make it to Erebus Field, at least? And, by the way, why did you stop? Is there a large number of nightmare creatures between us and the city gate?"
None of the members of the cohort answered, which was strange in and of itself. What made Sonny really anxious, though, were the fallen expressions on their faces.
"On what?"
Dorn remained silent for a bit, then turned his head in the direction of the mountain pass.
It would be easier if we just showed you, sir.
They walked through the camp, and then crested the slope of the pass. From there, Sonny had a clear view of Erebus Field, which was supposed to be half a dozen kilometers further north. Supposed to, with a frozen expression. Sonny looked through the falling ash at the dreadful sight below. His sunken eyes were hidden by deep, dark shadows.
"Curse it all."
Erebus Field was no more. The dark skies were shrouded by a veil of slowly falling ash, far below the mountain pass, illuminated by foreboding red glow. A vast metropolis lay in ruins. The shattered buildings were drowning in rivers of lava, and a terrible conflagration was raging across the devastated land, devouring what little was left of the once thriving city. Above the scene of devastation, the dark shape of Mount Erebus was wreathed in smoke. A flood of molten rock was flowing down its slopes. Glowing through the haze, the walls of the city were breached, and uncountable hordes of nightmare creatures were prowling in the ruins, some bathing in the flames, some avoiding it. Looking down with a dead expression on his pale, tired face, Sonny found himself momentarily unable to feel anything.
"Doesn't make any sense."
Erebus Field had been one of the most prominent cities in Antarctica, famous for its geothermal energy farms, fertile soil, and warmth. It had been home to tens of millions of people even before becoming an evacuation center. The local government branch had been supposed to have the volcano well under control, even if all the safety systems they had in place were to suffer a cataclysmic failure. The city had possessed formidable fortifications long before being converted into a siege capital. With those in place, and a whole division of the First Army working on reinforcing the defensive infrastructure, as well as the presence of hundreds of awakened and more than a few masters, Erebus Field simply couldn't succumb to something as mundane as a volcanic eruption. Sonny asked how this could have happened. Sonny had been supposed to guide the convoy to this stronghold, deliver the refugees to the authorities, rendezvous with Davis and his cohort of irregulars, and then resume acting in his usual capacity as the captain of a fast-response combat unit. Instead, the city was gone. Davis and his people were nowhere to be found, and the responsibility of caring for the convoy of defenseless civilians was still pressing heavily on his shoulders. If anything, that weight had only become more burdensome. He was at his wit's end, with a sigh. Sunny rubbed his face, and then sat down on a nearby boulder. His eyes were still glued to the horrible scene below. He was simply unable to look away. The members of the cohort stood awkwardly around him, keeping silent. Sunny remembered that he was meant to be projecting an image of confidence as their leader, but was too rattled and angry to care. After a while, Bell cleared his throat and said that they were awaiting his orders. "Sir." Quentin glanced at the swordsman reproachfully, then sighed.
None of us really knows what to do. The mood among the civilians is pretty dark as well. Everyone is a bit shaken, I think. We did check the maps, though the next siege capital is to the northeast of here, over the mountains, about 300 kilometers away. Miss Bate and Professor Obel are currently searching for a good route.
Sunny silently shook his head.
There's no point. Siege capitals seem to be crumbling like sand castles these days. Who says that the next one will still be there by the time we arrive, if we even make it?
The irregulars glanced at each other with uncomfortable expressions. After a poignant pause, Kim asked,
What should we do then, sir?
Sunny let out a heavy sigh, then looked north. After a few moments of silence, he said,
Falcon Scott, that's our best hope. Even if all other siege capitals fall, it'll stand. It's the most fortified, and the First Army's presence is the strongest there. Most importantly, that's where St. Tyrus is. As long as she's defending the north, we'll be safe there.
Sunny didn't add that if something capable of taking Sky Tide out appeared, all of them would be better off committing suicide. Once saints started to die, mortals like them had no hope of making it out. Really. He also didn't mention that there were another 2,000 kilometers between them and Falcon Scott, twice as much as they had barely survived to get to Erebus Field from Low 49. Everyone here knew that. Since the cohort had started this damned campaign at the distant northern stronghold, returning to Falcon Scott would complete the calamitous circle. Granted, the situation would be slightly different as they moved further north, since that was where the First Army had first established its presence. The territories between Erebus Field and Falcon Scott were far better entrenched than the desolate regions in the south, where the army had come last. There would be established evacuation corridors, or at least remnants of them, supply depots, fortified outposts, well-maintained roads. Perhaps they would even meet friendly forces on the way.
Come to think of it, I should probably contact Army Command as soon as possible to get detailed information about the big picture.
The timing would be tricky, since the convoy was currently in a dire situation, with numerous nightmare creatures flooding the area. Sending even one irregular into the dream realm would diminish their ability to defend themselves. But it was better than remaining blind. His people needed sleep. Anyway, Sunny lingered for a few moments, then said,
Leave me for a bit, I need to think. Oh, make sure that the transports are as ready to move as they can be while you are at it.
He doubted that it would be safe to remain near the fallen city for long. The irregulars nodded, then backed off and headed toward the convoy's temporary camp, left alone. Sunny forced himself to look away from the ruins of Erebus Field and stared up at the sky, which was dark and obscured by clouds of ash.
Oh, damn it.
The 3 remaining civilian transports were overloaded and on the verge of irrevocably breaking down. Military vehicles should still be operational, but Sergeant Gier had probably run out of ammunition by now.
What the hell am I supposed to do?
As Sunny watched the sky, a black dot appeared above him. At first, he thought that it was just another flake of ash, but the dot moved too swiftly to be one. It dove down, slowly growing as it drew closer. A few seconds later, a black bird landed on a rock near him. It had glossy black feathers, smart round eyes, and a sharp beak that reminded him of spire messengers. With mild surprise, Sunny recognized it as a crow. He knew that one, at least. Birds were a little bit less extinct than mammals, so even though they were a rare sight in the outskirts, there were some. They usually didn't last long, though, however.
Why is there a crow in Antarctica?
Just as he thought it, the crow opened its beak and cawed. Its caws sounded terribly like words. Sani, Sani. As soon as the strange crow appeared, Sunny was ready to kill it. Summoning the moonlight shard would have only taken a split second, and a swift strike of his armored fist was going to do the job just as well. If it was an ordinary bird, of course, which he seriously doubted. He didn't expect the crow to speak, though. Sunny, Sunny. Is it calling my name? Sunny temporarily postponed his plans of killing the crow and stared at it for a bit. The crow tilted its head and stared back. Sunny.
Is it an echo, or am I losing my mind again?
He hesitated for a little while, then said cautiously. Sunny admitted, yes, I am Sunny. The bird jumped closer with a satisfied look, shook its entire body to get rid of flakes of ash clinging to the black feathers, and then cawed again. Jet, Jet. A spark of hope ignited in Sunny's heart. He studied the crow some more, then leaned closer and whispered.
Did Master Jet send you?
The small monster bobbed its head up and down several times, then cawed the words jet and send. Sunny closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, so she didn't forget about me after all. The crow appeared to be Soul Reaper's echo, which she had sent to find Sunny. It felt nice to be remembered, however. He wasn't sure how the black bird was supposed to help him, if that was Jet's intention at all. Was it simply a messenger to deliver new orders? Someone to guide him to Davis and his cohort of elite assassins? He hesitated for a moment.
Why did Master Jet send you to find me?
The small monster jumped a couple of times, then cawed the words crow and help, so it wasn't just a messenger. The echo was meant to assist him. Somehow, Sunny tried not to get too excited.
How are you going to help me? Are you going to lead me to Davis?
The black bird silently shook its head, making Sunny frown. He asked why not. The crow tilted its head, then called out the names Davies and the word dead. Sunny let out a heavy sigh, so pride was gone. His men probably hadn't made it out of Erebus Field, either. He didn't know the cold man too well, but the loss of a full cohort of irregulars still hit him hard. Not to mention that Sunny's hopes of linking up with another powerful master were crushed. From what he knew, that was the first serious casualties the irregulars had suffered from the start of the campaign. His information was outdated, though.
Who says that any of them are still alive?
The irregulars, and especially their captains, were elites among elites, but with how unreasonably dreadful the chain of nightmares was turning out to be, at least in the Antarctic center, there were no guarantees. Hell, he himself had all but died just a few hours ago. At least Soul Reaper was still out there, somewhere. A dark grimace appeared on Sunny's face. Looking back at the small bird, he asked in a dubious tone,
How are you supposed to help me, then?
The crow flapped its wings and cawed the words crow and show. Sunny frowned and asked, Show what? The bird stared at him for a few moments, then cawed again. Crow, show. Then it added. The crow cawed out Sunny's name, followed by the word follow.
It wants me to follow it.
He didn't have too much trust in the mere awakened monster's abilities, but if Master Jet had sent it, then there had to be a good reason. In any case, Sunny didn't have too many choices, although he didn't want to think it aloud. The convoy situation was more or less hopeless, with failing vehicles and an ocean of nightmare creatures surrounding them. The chances that he would be able to keep the refugees alive weren't too high. Sunny sighed, then nodded.
All right, we'll follow you. Just give me a bit of time to get my people on the road.
The crow stared at him for a bit, then flapped its wings again. Sunny muttered, You don't need to remind me. Hooray! Standing up, Sunny descended toward the convoy's camp and ordered everyone to prepare for departure. Soon, the column of vehicles left its temporary shelter and followed a narrow mountain road that circled the former Erebus field from a good distance. The crow flew above them, guiding the convoy deeper into the mountains. The bird had turned out to be an amazing scout. Not only was it able to notice swarms of nightmare creatures from high above long before they could threaten the column, but it was also smart enough to lead Sunny and his people around the prowling abominations. After about an hour of tense but uneventful driving, they left the site of the destroyed city behind. The scene of devastation was now obscured by the slopes and peaks, but the plume of smoke rising from the crater of Mount Erebus and the angry orange glow of the burning stronghold could still be seen. The crow guided the convoy to a wide crossroad, and then dove down. Landing near a small structure standing at the side of it, the convoy came to a halt, the civilian transports looking like they might not ever be able to get their engines running again, sparing them an uneasy glance. Sonny jumped down from the roof of the Rhino and approached the structure. It seemed freshly built, and was most likely constructed by the First Army just a month or two ago. He had no idea what its purpose was, though, uncertain, Sonny glanced at the black bird, who looked very proud of itself.
What am I supposed to do with that?
The crow tilted its head and cawed the words door and open. Oh. Despite its small size, the structure had actual blast doors blocking its entrance. The gate was large enough to be rammed by the Rhino, but of course, Sonny wasn't going to order Luster to do something that stupid. He briefly thought about cutting through the blast doors with the cruel sight, but then shook his head with a roll of eyes, walked over to a small panel at the side of the gate, and placed his palm on it. The panel lit up, and then a mechanical voice came from the inbuilt dynamics.
Captain Sunless verified sufficient clearance.
The blast doors opened, revealing the entrance to a wide tunnel.
Oh, hells no.
Sonny remained motionless for a while, cursing his fate, then reluctantly sent one of his shadows into the tunnel. Despite his newly established aversion to tunnels of all kinds, that one turned out to be rather short, leading to a vast underground chamber. It was rectangular in shape, and large enough for the several convoys the size of the one Sonny was leading to take shelter inside.
It's a hidden supply depot, a big one at that.
Sonny's eyes widened inside the underground garage. Rows and rows of pristine military vehicles stood, ready to be powered up and armed with full complements of heavy assault weapons. Sonny remained motionless for a while, until eventually there was a sound of footsteps approaching him. Turning around, he looked at Sergeant Gier with a blank expression. The soldier tensed, habitually expecting dreadful news. Sonny asked, What's in there?" Sonny lingered for a bit, then simply shook his head.
Order the convoy to drive inside, y'all see soon enough.
Before too long, the column of battered vehicles drove past him, disappearing into the dark tunnel. Once they were all inside, Sonny glanced at the falling ash one last time, then walked into the darkness himself. The blast doors closed behind him with a reverberating hum, cutting off the bitter cold and the chilling wind of the polar night. Just before the two plates of armored alloy touched, Master Jet's crow flew between them and landed on Sonny's shoulder. The bird glanced into the tunnel with curiosity, then stared at him and cawed a couple of times. For a change, those were simple caws and not mangled words of the human language. A pale smile appeared on Sonny's face.
Oh yeah, good job.
With that, he walked down the tunnel, soon reaching the underground garage. The convoy was parked in the empty corner of the vast chamber, and excited soldiers were already moving around the pristine military vehicles, evaluating their state. Someone else was busy opening alloy crates that were stacked along one of the walls, full of all kinds of supplies. The depot was brightly illuminated by powerful light fixtures, which had come online as soon as Sonny opened the gate using his command authority. The ventilation systems were also online, filling the underground space with the familiar, calming smell of artificially cleaned air. Sonny breathed in deeply and waited for Sergeant Gier to approach him, then asked, "So, how is it?" The soldier smiled, which made Sonny realize that he had never seen the dependable sergeant do that before. "It's nothing short of amazing, sir. This is a divisional field resupply station. From what I can tell, it's meant to replenish the expended resources of an entire division between battles. If there's no convenient opportunity to reach a fortified stronghold, or if the supply lines are cut, there's enough here to support the deployment of thousands of soldiers." He paused for a moment, and then pointed at the rows of vehicles. "We haven't assessed the full inventory yet, but you can already see that this is far more than we need. There are different types of machines, too, from armored personnel carriers to assault vehicles and light scouts. I mean, There's even a dozen MWRs here, with enough ammunition to load all their armaments. Sunny glanced at the towering shapes of the mobile war platforms standing near the back wall. These giant humanoid robots were about 6 meters tall, on the smaller side compared to their larger cousins, but they still packed a heavy punch. Samara's powerful rifle had been meant to serve as a light weapon for one of these formidable machines, but was later refitted to be used by the awakened sharpshooter. The presence of MWRs was a pleasant surprise. Mundane soldiers were somewhat capable of facing dormant nightmare creatures, but had troubles dealing with the awakened ones. Even with the help of exoskeleton armor suits, the fierce arsenal of guns and launchers installed on the war platforms, however, made them destructive enough to accomplish that task. There was just one problem. Sunny gave Sergeant Gier a dubious look.
Do we even have anyone capable of piloting these things?
The soldier coughed and awkwardly scratched the back of his head, then offered, "Oh, no, not really." He remained silent for a few moments, then smiled again. "Still, there's also ammunition for our turrets, as well as food, medicine, spare fuel cells, necessities. Basically, all that the refugees need. We can even arm them all if that's what you want to do. Those vehicles that we can drive are much faster than the civilian transports. 2, have better armor, and can navigate more difficult terrain. Not to mention that there's more of them than we can possibly use. Or everything, really. The infrastructure between here and Falcon Scott is also much better developed. So, I think both our speed and defensive capabilities are going to increase tremendously." Sunny nodded, then glanced briefly at the Crow, who had left his shoulder and was now perching on one of the beams of the support framework near the ceiling of the depot, looking down at the hustling humans with a curious expression.
Good, we'll be staying here for a couple of days, to let the people rest and give us time to get acquainted with all these shiny new toys. Make sure that everyone has a warm meal and a comfortable place to sleep.